Well, welcome everyone to episode 6 of FBC Pastors Talk. We're glad to have you back with us today if you've joined us for previous episodes, and welcome if you're joining us for the first time. I'm Pastor Jared, and on with me again today is Pastor Mike and Josh Branch, and we're going to continue talking about this whole idea of God being sovereign over evil. And we thought that this third episode on this subject would be really important because not only is this subject very weighty, and difficult and challenging to work through from a theological or philosophical perspective, it's also difficult to apply. These are hard things to think through when you yourself are going through the effects of evil in our world, whether moral or natural evil, or even whether someone else is going through them that you know and you're trying to give counsel. And so I think it was important for us to talk through just how do we think about these issues when we're trying to help someone else, or even to think biblically when we're going through difficult times. And Mike and Josh, I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say. Not only are you guys in positions where you're able to give pastoral counsel and you've worked with folks who are hurting, but you guys know what it's like even to be on the other side of that, as many people do in our church who have gone through difficult things. And I think of both you guys going through the difficult challenge of even losing little ones in the past. And so you have a perspective to offer that I think will be really, really helpful as we work through this. So my first question I want to throw over to you guys is just what have you learned about what not to say to those who are going through the effects of evil and going through something very, very difficult in their lives? Mike, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thanks again for joining us. And I mean, these are really hard things. There's a lot, there's natural evil, there's moral evil, as we've talked about. There's dealing with it when other people are going through it. And then there's when you're going through it. And so I think things not to say, I think first of all, it's important just to be silent for a while when you're listening to someone and you truly are slow to speak and you're trying to take in the weight of what's going on in someone's life. Because we all know that we can all find someone, or we all can find a situation that's worse than the one that you're hearing right now, right? But whatever said person is going through is the weightiest possible situation that they can go through and during it, because they're in the midst of it. And so they're thinking through things with you out loud, and they're trusting you. And so that in and of itself just elicits a full listening mode, compassion, to just hear them out, and to not be quick to give your counsel. At some point you come to that for sure, but I think just purely listening to start. So things not to say is there's a time, and we talked about a time for this, a time for that in Ecclesiastes even. Well, there's a time to speak, and there's a time to speak certain things. And so I think, one, being slow to speak, but not being quick to say things that may be even theologically accurate. Things such as God causes all things to work together for good. I mean, you wouldn't say it maybe in the exact way, but just even the quick response of, well, we know the Lord's going to use this for your good and for his glory. And that is ultimately true. And you have to get there at some point. But I think we just got to be slow and calm and quiet and just listen. I know I didn't say a lot about what not to say, but I think that's the essence of it. Would you agree with that, Josh?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things you have to realize if you're going through a traumatic event is you have to give grace to people, because they have good intentions and they end up in those good intentions totally sticking their foot in their mouth, often time and time again. I can think back to when we lost our firstborn son, Calvin. He was stillborn. A lot of people would say things and they meant well, but what they ended up doing is they were discounting his life. And so that was something that we had to realize, is that people are just awkward and they don't know what to say. And so instead of like you mentioned, Mike, sometimes the best thing to say is nothing at all, just to come alongside somebody, put your arm around them, and just say, hey, I'm here for you. It's when in that awkwardness somebody tries to fix the problem somehow, that sometimes foolish things are said, or things that people just aren't ultimately thinking of. And so you have to skip a beat. Don't take those things personally. Give grace to people and forgive them, because they oftentimes don't even realize they're saying those things. I think another thing, what not to say is realize that you can't fix a lot of life's problems. Even pointing to the scriptures, the truth, great gospel theology, rich truths, don't fix the pain that people are going through. There's hope there for sure, but that's part of this problem of evil that we deal with. Is it's there, and it will not go away until Christ comes again, and until we're in glory, and until that happens. Part of even our sanctification, I would argue, is how we deal with the struggles of life.
Well, I think you said something there, Josh, that I just a couple things. One is time. When someone's going through a horrendous, evil, just difficult time, they're speaking to you, hoping that you will just listen. And so the time that you allow for them to just pour. I mean, I remember when we, lost our little one at, I think, 21 weeks. Jared, actually, you called me. I'm at the hospital before, this. My wife's, making hard decisions, and it was just simply you listening. Just simply listening, and there's like an outlet there that you can. It's not venting; it's working through it out loud, and realizing as the listener. I think you already said this, Josh, that don't run to fix the problem or to try and make it make sense, because from our perspective, it may not make sense. And Ecclesiastes speaks to that, right? Where there are things that they're not going to make sense under the sun. We have hope, and we can see that, the eternal hope that we have, and we can step back at some point. But some of these things in the midst of them, it's like, it just doesn't make sense, nor will it maybe on this side of heaven.
That's one of the things that Christians can often be guilty of, is reducing very complex, emotional issues in life down to what we'd call platitudes. Things that while true and good and sometimes helpful, are really too simplistic for these complex things, and oftentimes should really be left unsaid.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you guys right, it's not to say that Scripture does not speak directly to a situation someone's going through, or may not. Doesn't mean that it won't be helpful to them. It's about timing, sensitivity, and not just timing, but even allowing for, I think even having in our theology, allowing for the time of even mourning or being unsettled about a situation that is bad, that has occurred. That something that is the result of evil and sin in the world, that there should be a being disturbed and even emotional about that. And I think sometimes we even communicate a wrong theology about the world if we do not allow for that and recognize that these are bad things, and these are things that do hurt, and these things are hard. So yeah, I think it's both the time. It's not only knowing what to say, which I think sometimes might be at that time nothing, but then at the right time and allowing for people to go through that. So being there in that way, I think that's real helpful, and I think we see that in even the ministry of Jesus. We can talk about an example of that in a moment. But so how do you, though, keep those things and from becoming platitudes? Like what, I mean, is it literally, does it take the right person at the right time to come along eventually if we are continuing to struggle with something that's happened in our life, a result of evil? Yeah, I mean, how do you see the Lord normally working then to help us along to process evil things that happen?
I mean, we cannot be silent as Christians because we do have the book. And so there's that slowness, there's timing, there's sensitivity. And so then you have to come to bringing truth to people, but even in bringing truth to people, it has to be full of grace, full of compassion, full of, I'm pouring out my heart to you, which is attached to the truth, right? Which is bringing the truth alongside of it to help you. You're lamenting, you're hurting, and yet I want to bring you hope. And I want to kind of hold your hand, if you want to say, come alongside you in the midst of this, not by myself though, because ultimately it's not us that is going to bring hope to this person. It's God using us as like a conduit, to bring them the sweetness of his truth and the sweetness of his love. He uses us as his hand and feet. So it's now we bring the truth, but it has to be full of grace and compassion. And I'll be transparent with you guys. This is something that you have to really work at it, because sometimes, myself included, we are hurting over things that maybe someone looks at us and says, you got to move on. But that's not the best or wisest thing to say, because whatever they're hurting with is real to them. And so we have to meet them where they're at, and then slowly, I don't even know if the term bring them along is good, because by saying bring them along, you're saying they're not in the right place. And I guess in some ways they're not, in the sense of you got to get them to the big picture. But you have to point them, I guess, in the right direction in the midst of the difficulty. And that's we got to be strategic and slow.
And I would say, don't neglect or forsake the acknowledgement of their suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Look into that face of evil in whatever form it is, and sit there and just restate that. And you can do that in a way that points to Christ and the gospel. I remember I had a friend who called me when we lost our son, and he was just weeping on the phone with me. And he just said, I don't know what to say, because this isn't the way the world was originally created. What you're experiencing right now is a direct result of the fall, and I don't know what to say except for it's evil. And that was helpful. He didn't go on to a big long theological diatribe. It was simply stated. It was grounded in truth. It was an acknowledgement of the suffering, and then it was helpful.
What that little phrase you just said, it was simple, is huge. Especially pastors, we want to tell everyone all the truths, and it's like, no, slow down and just be simplistic and be principle driven of the truth, and just let it lay there, and then let the Spirit work.
Josh, I think what you said there, I think ties in great with an example we do see in the ministry of Jesus in John 11. At the funeral of Lazarus, when he came into the town where Lazarus had died. He had heard of that. Martha, I believe it was, meets him on the outskirts of town and tells him what happens, and he keeps coming in. And eventually he comes to the place where Mary was in the home, weeping herself. And we know that there were those professional mourners also weeping there as well. And it's so striking what it does say in John 11:33, where it says, therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping, speaking of Mary, and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled. And that groaning there is even this, carries this idea of being agitated, and some marginal readings even say indignant. And there are some commentators over the years that actually would suggest that Jesus is a bit, I want to be careful here, almost angry here, not at the weeping, because he himself is going to be weeping in a few moments where it says Jesus wept, but almost as if he's entering in, putting himself in their shoes in the frustration of, this is what sin has brought. This is the result of a broken world, that he is disturbed by the fact that he is that this family who he loves had to experience death and have a brother die. And Jesus, of course, loved Lazarus too. And so you see Jesus taking this time to go through those emotions with them. And then, of course, later on, momentarily, he'll talk about him being the resurrection and the life, and he'll, give that encouragement there. But Jesus not only feeling that, but then also weeping as well. And I just think that does teach us so much about, how we should be interacting with those who go through the results of evil.
I mean, there's a couple that alone is significant, but then even the fact that he came, right? That he invested his time and he came, not to earth, which is huge, but that he went to the situation, right? That he didn't from a distance say, oh, I'll take care of it, or and not, I mean, we all say this, like, I will pray for so and so, but there's something about physical presence in the midst of a really difficult situation. And so you put everything aside and you just sit with someone, or you weep with someone, or you intently, just look into their eyes as they are weeping. And it's a powerful thing that says, I care, and you see that with Jesus, right? He went from not being there, he shows up on the scene, and then there's this sense of like frustration, as you're saying. And then, as we see in verse 35, then he weeps. It's a really powerful picture of what that looks like as we come alongside others, or as others come alongside us.
And taking the time to do that, knowing he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, knowing he was going to do that, he takes the time to enter in with them and experience this with them, and almost acknowledge that, yeah, you're right. There is something wrong with this. It is powerful. Josh, we're going to add something there.
Yeah, there's just a really pure moment there where we see a different aspects of Jesus's humanity, where it should cause us great confidence, as the book of Hebrews says, for us to be able to come to the throne boldly with confidence, because he knows what it's like to be in our shoes. Right? Jesus knows what it's like to be tired. He knows what it's like to be sad and to grieve and to mourn. And so when we go through these things in life, we can come to him and pour out our heart to him, and know that just as he showed Lazarus's family compassion, he'll show us compassion. Mm-hmm. And that even reminds me of an Old Testament verse in Psalms. Psalms 56:8. It says, you have kept count of my tossings. You have put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your book? Mm-hmm. And we know from elsewhere in Scripture that if God cares for the sparrow, will he not care for us, right? And here in the book of Psalms, it says that not only does he number each of the heads on our hairs, but he has bottled our tears. Mm-hmm. You want to talk about a belief system that is encouraging, that we have a God who isn't just sitting on high, who doesn't know what it's like to be human. We have somebody who can feel with us in every way that we exist, and that he acknowledges even our tears.
If you jump down to verse 38, I mean, it goes on and says that, at least in the ESV, it says, then Jesus deeply moved again. And then I mean, it even gets graphic, if you want to say, where it says by this time there's an odor, and it just shows the, I mean, he's in not just an emotional situation, but it's not a pleasant situation he's in, and it's just, you just keep, investing yourself, pouring yourself into someone and to people. And that, again, that physical presence there, I was just thinking, so sad, how many of these emotional things are put in the social media or in the blogosphere world nowadays, that people want to share their hearts, and yet they don't have real people that come alongside them, and so they're left lonely and with no hope in so many ways. And I mean, just the glory of the church, that we are called to invest into one another, not if, but when all these hard times come.
Mike, something that popped in my mind that you talked based on what you said earlier in terms of knowing when people to get people a certain place, or to kind of get them to move on beyond something. I think another trap we can't fall into is that we cannot assume they're not in a good place because they are sorrowing. And you guys have said this, and this is another way, but I think of some passages, I think it's 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, I believe in 2 Corinthians 6:10, where Paul says, are sorrowful yet always rejoicing. And so it does show us there that you're able to have two legitimate emotions at the same time that can go on and not have them be wrong. Sorrow, pain, heartache, but yet rejoicing, which we know doesn't mean happiness. It means being able to have joy because of seeing something of the Lord. And I know that it might even take time for people to get to that place. I get that. But I'm talking about after a while, they still may have sorrow over something, while they're able to rejoice and have joy in the Lord, but yet still have sorrow simultaneously. So getting beyond, or getting to the place we need to be, doesn't necessarily mean we don't have sorrow. It just might mean we have sorrow in the midst of rejoicing. Just like in 1 Thessalonians, when Paul said he wanted them not to sorrow as those who have no hope, in 1 Thessalonians 4 about their dead loved ones. So you can have hope and rejoicing in the midst of sorrow. Again, I'm not suggesting that has to be there the first moment, the first day, the first week of when you're going through something hard. I'm just saying that on the flip side, there may always be sorrow. That just might be a part of life.
And that's where I said it's not, I don't think moving them out of or along is probably the best phrase. It's just pointing them, because the Lord may have it. And this is really hard to, wrap our finite minds around, but the Lord may have it where the circumstances we're in may not change for a long time, or may not change ever. And so how do we still, in the midst of difficulty that may be for a short time or maybe for a long time, yet still have joy in the midst of that difficulty? And so it's not changing, it's not moving them. It's just pointing them to hope.
And that even gets into a whole nother aspect where, we don't expect people to be fake and plastic, right? And so when you see somebody, on a Sunday morning, when things are normal and you actually see people on a Sunday morning, when you see someone on a Sunday morning and you ask them how they are, you have to give people that freedom to express the struggles of life. And, if somebody says, oh, not so good, you don't lambast them and judge them for being a bad Christian because they're struggling with something, or they're sad, or they're sorrowful, or whatever. That is the human range of emotion. And it is okay to have those thoughts and those feelings. And you can do those, like you said, Jared, and still have the joy of the Lord and not be in sin. Likewise, you could have those emotions and be in sin. But all too often, I think, when people aren't, hey, I'm doing great, all right, you automatically think there's a sin problem or something.
Yeah, or they're not thinking correctly, or there's something wrong biblically, and it may just be they have sorrow over a very real, effective evil, in their life, and that's okay. Yeah.
I mean, just we're thinking. I mean, we've been talking about I mean, losing someone or something, or but I mean, there's all forms of sorrow, aren't there? I mean, there's different types of sorrow that people go through. I mean, there's a sorrow that parents have for their children, right? Whether it be that they see them making what they see as illogical decisions in their life, or unwise decisions, or whether it be that their child just doesn't know the Lord. And so there's even those type of sorrows that they just want to share that with someone, and then be able to sit down and just talk through those things. And for us to just move on from those things, that's where, like, theology is great if it turns into practice, and if like, kind of like we said before, if you put clothes on it, where it can lead people, it can encourage people, it can challenge people, it can help them in their lament. And I know that's near and dear to my heart, because you see young people that walk away, and their parents, it's a struggle.
So Josh, I wanted to ask you something earlier. You alluded to the fact that that we need to show grace to others when they're ministering to us, when we're going through difficulties, and there's things we have to think through. Why don't you expand on that? What are some key things we really need to be thinking about, based on what you've experienced, when people are trying to help us when we're going through difficulties?
I can speak to this because, like we mentioned, I've experienced tragedy in my life, and I fully realize that almost everyone has, and if you haven't, then just wait, it's coming. And so I guess I can just open up a little bit about our experience. So we lost our firstborn son as a result of a chromosomal abnormality that he had, and there was a whole bunch of doctor's visits and trying to get us to abort Calvin, and all sorts of things that were really, really difficult there. But my wife was able to carry him to term, and we were thankful for that. And he passed just before he was born. And what's interesting in a situation like that is it was an extended grieving process. In fact, I would say most of the grieving had happened maybe originally at the diagnosis, the days and weeks that followed. And then we were pretty, convinced by the stats that he wasn't going to make it too long. So after that happened, you have this whirlwind of activity where you get to see the church in action, which is awesome, and people love you, and they throw themselves at you in all sorts of ways, tangible and emotional, and we're getting cookies dropped off to our house, and meals, and our flock reached out and even gave us some money towards a vacation just to get away, and awesome things which were very helpful. In fact, I would say one of the things you can do when somebody is going through something is try to take simple decisions just off their plate. So meals are a great thing that you can do, and I think our body specifically does that really, really well, and we're thankful to that. But then as the crisis kind of wanes, and people start to move on with their lives, what you have to realize is that somebody going through the death of a loved one, or a sickness, life doesn't return to normal for them. And that's really, really hard, because in that place you see the rest of the world go back to living, and in your eyes you're still just as hurt and fragile and questioning as before. And sometimes that's really hard to see, is hey, how comes you get to go back to what you're doing before all this, and I'm left here in the pain of life. And so just an acknowledgement that pain doesn't immediately go away, I think, is super helpful for somebody going through a storm. An acknowledgement that the storm sometimes doesn't let up for a long, long time. I mean, there's definitely truth in the sense that time brings healing, absolutely. But sometimes it takes months, years, for somebody to really be able to move on. So those are some things that I would say from our own experience that we saw. And maybe even more specifically, because I think it's a common occurrence that, we don't talk about too often, even is miscarriages and deaths relating to babies, is try not to offer platitudes like, oh, you can always try again. Or, hey, at least you have the nursery painted, or like things like that are not wise words to say. And then likewise, you need to give people grace when they say foolish things, because their intentions are good. But hey, we live in a state of sin, and people are gonna be people.
I was just thinking back to what you were saying, Jared, that Josh or anyone going through the difficulties, again, thankfully, we don't grieve like those who have no hope. I mean, he will make all things right again, and even to a greater degree. And you talked about bottling tears earlier, Josh. Well, there's a time where there's not going to be any tears. And so again, at some point, coming to that big perspective of, I don't understand all this, but I do know this, that Jesus came and made all things right. Ultimately, he will make all things right again, and I have faith in that. I trust in his plan. I don't even necessarily like it sometimes. And I think that's okay to say. We don't always like the struggles of life that we go through, but we can still at the same time say, I don't like it, but I still trust of what he's taking me through and allowing to happen. And you can have those things run parallel to one another.
Well, I appreciate so much both you guys opening up, about those difficult experiences. But looking back now, years later, and what you learned and what the Word of God has to say about it, and how we can, as pastors and those, but even those who just are going to have people in our lives who go through these things, and we ourselves, as Josh says, we live in a world that's affected by sin, and we too will go through the effects of sin and the various evils. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Pastor Jared and Pastor Mike. For more information about Faith Bible Church, or about just the eternal life that only Jesus can offer, that hope that we point to, please visit our website at faithcanton.com, or contact Pastor Jared or Mike at jared@faithcanton.com and mike@faithcanton.com. Also, we invite you to connect with us on Facebook at facebook.com/faithbiblecanton, or via YouTube at youtube.com/faithbiblechurch. From all of us at Faith Bible Church, goodbye, and we hope to see you next time.